The gate opened at 6 in the morning, before the county even knew what Walt Heron was planning. Water poured across a cornfield that had survived 3 years of drought without losing a single healthy row. Neighbors driving past on the county road slowed their trucks, then stopped, then climbed out and stood at the fence line, watching a grown man flood his own crop on purpose. One of them shouted across the corn that Walt had finally lost his mind. Walt didn't answer. He stood ankle-deep in the rising water, with the clipboard in one hand, watching the surface the way other men watch a poker table. A county water inspector arrived within the hour, sent by a call from a worried neighbor. He ordered Walt to shut the gate. Walt refused, calmly, and said something the inspector would repeat for years afterward. "If this water disappears where I think it will, none of us are going to think about this field the same way again." The inspector didn't understand what that meant. Neither did the farmers at the fence. Nobody standing there that morning had any idea that within 18 months, water rights lawyers from 3 states would be fighting over that exact patch of Nebraska mud, or that the flood Walt started with a rusted hand crank would eventually be worth more than every acre of corn his family had grown across 4 generations combined. This wasn't a story about corn. It never had been. It was a story about what had been running silently beneath that field the entire time, waiting for someone stubborn enough to go looking for it. Walt Heron was not the kind of man people expected to find something extraordinary. He'd left the family farm at 19 to study civil engineering in Lincoln, spent 22 years designing municipal water systems for towns most people couldn't find on a map, and came home only when his father's health failed and someone had to run the place. Locals considered him an outsider who happened to have the right last name. He didn't talk like a farmer. He didn't think like one either. Where his neighbors rotated crops and prayed for rain, Walt spent his evenings poring over soil moisture readings and elevation data most of them had never heard of. He turned down 2 offers from developers who wanted to buy his least productive acreage for well above market value. His sister asked him directly why he wouldn't sell land that barely produced a crop worth harvesting. "There's something under there," he told her. "I don't know what yet, but I'm not selling it until I do." Nobody in the family took that seriously. His late father's old farmhand, a man named O.T.T. Delacroix, who'd worked the property for 3 decades, said Walt had always been a little too curious for a farmer. It wasn't meant as a compliment. But O.T.T. also mentioned something that stuck with people later, that Walt's grandfather used to talk about a stretch of ground on the eastern edge of the property that never dried out the way the rest of the land did, even in the worst dry years anyone could remember. Nobody had written it down. Nobody had measured it. It was just something old men said, the kind of local folklore every farming county collects and eventually forgets. The turning point came from an unlikely source, a box of digitized county surveying records that Walt requested from the state archive almost as a formality, part of a routine title search he was doing before refinancing his equipment loan. Buried inside was a 1930s soil and drainage survey conducted by a federal agency during the height of the Dust Bowl, when the government was mapping groundwater across the entire region to figure out which farms might survive the drought and which wouldn't. The report covered dozens of counties. Most of it was routine, but one paragraph, easy to miss, described a section of Walt's land using a phrase no modern hydrology report used anymore. "Living ground," the surveyor had written, which resists the drying pattern of the surrounding terrain and appears to retain subsurface moisture through mechanisms not yet understood. Walt read that line 4 times. Then he called the state archive back and asked if there were any follow-up surveys. There weren't. Whatever the surveyor had noticed in 1936 had never been investigated further. The Dust Bowl ended, the rains eventually came back, and the mystery of Walt's eastern field was filed away and forgotten for nearly 90 years. He brought the phrase to two people he trusted. A retired geology professor from the state university dismissed it outright, calling it likely folklore, dressed up in scientific language by a surveyor trying to sound thorough. A hydrologist Walt had worked with years earlier during his engineering career took it more seriously, pointing out that Dust Bowl era surveyors were often more precise than people gave them credit for, working without modern equipment but with sharp instincts built from years in the field. The two experts couldn't agree, and their disagreement only sharpened Walt's interest instead of settling it. He wasn't going to resolve the question by asking more people what they thought. He needed to see it for himself. An older woman at the County Historical Society, who'd spent decades collecting oral histories from families across the region, told Walt something that stayed with him longer than either expert's opinion. Her own grandmother had grown up 2 farms, over from the Heron Place, and used to warn children away from that eastern stretch during wet years, saying the ground there drank faster than the sky could pour. Nobody in her family had ever explained what that meant. It was simply a rule handed down, repeated without understanding, the way so much rural memory survives long after its origin is lost. Walt asked her if she had anything written down. She didn't. What she had was a memory of a memory, passed through 3 generations, of women who'd never once needed to know why the warning existed, only that it did. That decision was what led to the flood. Instead of hiring an excavation crew or drilling test wells the way any conventional operation would have, Walt designed something simpler and far cheaper, a controlled surface flood using an old irrigation gate his grandfather had installed decades earlier and nobody had used in years. He mixed a harmless tracer dye into the water, placed a dozen handheld moisture sensors across a half-mile grid, and recorded everything with a drone he'd bought secondhand from a crop dusting outfit going out of business. His neighbors thought he'd finally cracked under the pressure of running the farm alone. Haute Tite Delacroix, watching from the fence with his arms crossed, muttered that he'd seen a lot of strange things on that property but never a grown man flooding. Good ground just to watch it disappear. For the first 3 attempts, nothing happened. The water spread, set, and slowly evaporated the way water does on any ordinary field. Walt adjusted his gate timing, moved his sensors, and tried again. His sister told him he was wasting diesel and time chasing a sentence written by a man who'd been dead for 60 years. On the 4th attempt, one sensor stopped registering water at all. Not slowly. Almost instantly, as if the ground beneath it had simply swallowed everything poured onto it. Walt didn't understand what he was looking at until 9 hours later, when a colleague from his engineering days, checking a favor Walt had asked for, called to tell him that a groundwater monitoring station 11 miles away, one that had nothing to do with Walt's farm and had never shown unusual readings before, had picked up a sudden spike in flow. 11 miles. 9 hours. The math didn't make sense for surface runoff or normal aquifer seepage. Something was moving water underground fast in a direction nobody had mapped. Walt drove to the monitoring station himself the next morning and asked to see the raw data. The technician on duty, unaware of what Walt had been doing on his own land, simply handed it over. The timing lined up almost exactly with the 4th flood. What followed was months of quiet, methodical work that Walt mostly kept to himself. He pulled every archived geological survey he could find covering the region, cross-referenced old drainage maps, and slowly built a picture of something nobody currently working in water management had ever documented: a buried recharge corridor, a natural channel of porous rock and gravel laid down by an ancient river system long before anyone farmed the land above it, still carrying water underground across county lines. It wasn't a river in any sense people would recognize. There was no surface, no banks, nothing visible at all. It was closer to an underground highway, quietly moving water through the earth the way it had for thousands of years, undisturbed and unnoticed by nearly every generation of farmers who'd worked the ground directly above it. The scientific question was fascinating. The legal question was about to become a nightmare. Water law in that part of the country was a tangle even seasoned attorneys struggled to untangle cleanly. Surface water belonged to one set of rules. Groundwater belonged to another. Historic easements from railroad expansion a century earlier still carried legal weight in certain counties. Mineral rights sold off decades ago by families who never imagined water would ever be treated as a commodity complicated things further. Nobody could say with confidence who actually owned the right to whatever was flowing beneath Walt's field, or whether discovering it changed anything about who could claim it. A land use attorney Walt consulted told him plainly that this kind of dispute could take years to settle, and that he should prepare for people with far more resources than him to get involved quickly once word spread. Word spread faster than anyone expected. The break came from an old land agreement Walt found while searching county deed records for anything relevant to his property line. It was a document from 1948, drawn up between his great-grandfather and a regional irrigation cooperative that no longer existed, granting what the paperwork called subsurface recharge privileges across a defined section of the property in exchange for cooperative membership dues. Nobody alive had used that phrase in decades. Modern water law didn't even have a clean equivalent for it. Whether a 76-year-old agreement using obsolete terminology still carried legal force was a question that would eventually require a judge to decide, but the document alone was enough to make Walt's position considerably stronger than anyone expected from a working farmer with no legal team behind him. His attorney called it the strangest piece of paper she'd seen in 15 years of practice. She also told Walt not to talk to anyone else about it until she understood exactly what it meant. That advice came too late. A university hydrology department, hearing secondhand about unusual groundwater readings in the area, reached out and asked to study the site independently. Walt agreed, driven by genuine curiosity and by a clear sense that independent verification would matter if this ever ended up in court. Their findings confirmed what Walt already suspected. The underground corridor was real, substantial, and connected to a wider aquifer system serving multiple counties. Where the scientists disagreed was on what should happen next. Some argued the corridor should be studied and left alone. Others argued it represented significant resource that regional water planners needed to account for immediately, given the drought conditions much of the state had been living under for years. The disagreement among the researchers ran deeper than most outsiders realized. One senior hydrologist argued the corridor should be left completely undisturbed, warning that any large-scale extraction could destabilize a system that had taken thousands of years to form and might collapse the moment modern infrastructure tried to control it. A younger researcher on the same team pushed back, arguing that leaving a resource this significant unmanaged during an active drought crisis was its own kind of risk, one that could cost struggling farms far more than any careful extraction plan ever would. Walt sat through both arguments without taking a side publicly, though his attorney noticed he took considerably more notes during the caution first presentation than the other. Once university researchers started publishing preliminary findings, the story stopped being a quiet local curiosity. Agricultural conglomerates called first, offering to lease drilling rights on land Walt hadn't even proven he could legally control. A regional water utility sent a representative who spent an afternoon walking the property asking pointed questions about flow rates. An investment fund based out of Chicago, the kind that had been quietly buying up water rights across the drought-stricken West for years, sent a man named Preston Kell to Walt's farm in a black GMC pickup that looked out of place next to every other truck on the county road. Kell didn't want to lease anything. He wanted to buy the entire eastern section outright, at a price nearly 10 times what the land alone was worth, and he made it clear his firm had already identified similar corridors in 2 neighboring counties and understood exactly what documented recharge rights would be worth once regional water planning caught up to the science. Walt didn't say yes. He also didn't say no, not right away. Everyone at the fence that week, farmers who'd known Walt his entire life, assumed he'd eventually take the money. Nobody turns down a number that large for land that had never earned its keep. A state environmental office called the same week, asking whether Walt intended to register the corridor as a protected recharge zone, a designation that would limit future development, but also secure long-term monitoring, funding, and legal protection against over-extraction by outside operators. A separate call came from a county commissioner who wanted to understand what any of this meant for tax valuation on land that had suddenly become the subject of a bidding war nobody in the office had anticipated. Walt found himself fielding calls from people whose job titles he'd never had reason to learn, all of them circling the same 40 acres his family had once considered the least valuable part of the farm. Before making any decision, Walt did something that made even his own attorney nervous. He opened the gate a second time in front of witnesses, drone footage running, university researchers on site with thermal cameras and equipment far more sophisticated than what he'd used the first time around. What the footage captured became the moment the story stopped being a local curiosity and started circulating well beyond the county. The flooded water didn't spread randomly across the field the way ordinary surface water does. It moved in visible, almost geometric patterns, pulled toward specific points as if something below was actively drawing it in. Thermal imaging revealed distinct channels running beneath the topsoil, invisible from the surface but unmistakable from above. Then, roughly 40 yards from where the flood began, cold water started rising from ground that hadn't held a spring in living memory. A dry depression at the field's edge, one Walt's grandfather used to call the old wet spot, without anyone knowing why, filled with clear, cold water within an hour and stayed that way. Preston Kell was standing at the fence line when it happened, alongside the same neighbors who'd called Walt crazy months earlier. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Kell asked, quietly, what Walt planned to do now that everyone could see exactly what this was worth. The number researchers eventually settled on, once regional water authorities got involved and began calculating the corridor's value in terms of drought resilience, municipal water contracts, and environmental credit programs, exceeded $50 million. Not for the water itself, but for the documented, legally defensible rights to manage and allocate it across a region that badly needed exactly this kind of resource as droughts grew longer and less predictable. Walt had spent less than $4,000 on sensors, dye, and drone footage to find it. The question wasn't whether the discovery had value anymore. Everyone agreed on that. The question was what Walt intended to do with something that large, and whether a man who'd spent his whole career designing water systems for other communities was capable of walking away from the kind of money that could set his family up for generations. Walt turned down Preston Kell's offer in October. In a short meeting his Attorney later described as the calmest conversation she'd ever witnessed involving that much money. Instead of selling the rights outright, Walt proposed something almost nobody in the room expected: a regional recharge management agreement, drafted with help from the university, researchers, and a handful of neighboring farmers who'd have direct access to monitored groundwater during future droughts. The agreement gave Walt's family a modest, ongoing share of any future water allocation revenue rather than a single enormous payout. It gave university researchers permanent access to study the corridor. It gave surrounding farms, including several owned by people who had stood at Walt's fence calling him crazy, a documented legal claim to water security they'd never had before. Preston Kell's firm walked away from the negotiation entirely. Other investors quietly did the same once it became clear Walt wasn't interested in selling to the highest bidder. His sister asked him, not long after the papers were signed, whether he had any regrets about turning down that kind of money. "I wasn't trying to get rich off water," Walt told her. "I was trying to figure out what my grandfather saw and nobody else believed." 2 years later, the corridor still runs beneath Walt's field, and beneath a much wider stretch of the county than anyone initially realized. Regional water planners now factor it into long-term drought models. A graduate student at the university has spent 18 months mapping its full extent, with no end to the project in sight. Neighboring farms that once mocked Walt openly now send their own soil samples to the same lab he uses. Haute la Croix, still working the property part-time despite being well past retirement age, tells visitors the story a little differently every time, though the ending never changes. He usually finishes by pointing toward the old wet spot at the field's edge. Still full, still cold, still there. Whether the corridor will hold up the way current models predict, or whether the region's water future depends on something even larger still, undiscovered beneath other farms nearby, remains an open question. Nobody, not the university, not the state, not Walt himself, can answer with certainty yet. What's certain is that on an ordinary morning in a county most people will never visit, a man nobody expected to find anything opened a gate his grandfather installed, and let the ground answer a question that had been waiting almost a century to be asked. If stories like this one, about the things hiding beneath ordinary ground and the people stubborn enough to go looking for them, are the kind of history you enjoy, there's a lot more of it waiting. Subscribe to keep finding it.